August 10th, 1944. Dawn breaks over Myatkina as Allied forces storm the final Japanese positions. In a hidden compound, Sergeant Sullivan's unit discovers 20 Korean women, ages 17 to 25, in conditions that defy human understanding. These women had been promised factory work but delivered into hell. They flinch at every male voice, expect violence instead of mercy. For 3 years they learned that kindness always comes with a price, but then something impossible happens. Sullivan rises early one Sunday morning and begins making pancakes, not because he's ordered to, but because his sister always loved them on Sunday mornings. Soonja, who hasn't trusted a soul in years, smells that familiar sweetness. She takes one bite and suddenly breaks down, not from sadness, but from recognizing simple kindness with no strings attached. These Japanese comfort girls broke in tears when U.S. soldiers served them pancakes for breakfast. It wasn't the food that healed them, it was finally believing that genuine goodness could exist in a world gone mad. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button for more untold tales from history. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. These powerful stories deserve to reach every corner of the world. The morning sun cut through the smoke and dust hanging over Myatkina like a blade, casting long shadows across the battered compound where Sergeant Tommy Sullivan crouched beside a splintered wooden door. His boots crunched on broken glass as he signaled to his squad, their faces streaked with grime and exhaustion after 3 days of house-to-house fighting. The Japanese had made their final stand here, and now silence filled the spaces where gunfire had echoed just hours before. "Building's clear, Sarge," Corporal McDougal called out, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man who'd seen too much. "But you're going to want to see this." Sullivan pushed through the doorway and stopped. The stench hit him first, unwashed bodies, fear, and something else he couldn't identify, but made his stomach turn. Then his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through barred windows, and he saw them. 20 young women huddled against the far wall like wounded animals, their ages ranging from what looked like 17 to perhaps 25. Some clutched torn fabric that might once have been dresses. Others sat motionless, staring at nothing. "Jesus Christ!" whispered Private Anderson behind him. "Shut it!" Sullivan snapped, though his own throat felt tight. He'd liberated prisoner camps before, but this was different. These weren't soldiers. These were girls, some barely older than his sister Margaret had been. Lieutenant Chen appeared in the doorway, his usually composed face showing the strain of the past few days. "What's the situation here?" Sullivan gestured helplessly at the women. "I don't know what the hell this is, sir. They won't respond to English. Most of them won't even look at us." Chen stepped forward carefully, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He spoke in what Sullivan recognized as Japanese, his voice gentle. A few of the women looked up, but their expressions showed only terror. One girl, she couldn't be more than 19, pressed herself further into the corner, her dark eyes wide with a fear so deep it seemed to come from her bones. "They're Korean," Chen said quietly after attempting several languages. "At least most of them. I'm getting fragments, something about factories, about promises of work." His jaw tightened. "I think they were trafficked here, Sarge. Forced into God knows what." The girl in the corner caught Sullivan's attention. She sat apart from the others, her black hair hanging like a curtain around her face. Something about the way she held herself, protective but alert, broken but not defeated, reminded him painfully of Margaret during those final months when the tuberculosis had ravaged her body but not her spirit. "We need to get them medical attention," Sullivan said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "And food. When's the last time they ate?" "I'll radio for medics," Chen replied. "But Sarge, they're terrified of us. Look at them. They think we're going to hurt them." Sullivan studied the women more carefully. Several bore visible bruises in various stages of healing. Their clothes were little more than rags. The girl in the corner wore what looked like the remnants of a factory uniform, though it was so torn and stained he could barely make out the original blue fabric. "Mac," he called to the corporal, Get some blankets from the supply truck, clean ones, and see if you can find some water." McDougal nodded and disappeared. Sullivan turned back to the women, crouching down slowly to make himself less imposing. The movement caused several of them to flinch, and the girl in the corner pulled her knees tighter to her chest. "Easy," he said softly, though he knew they couldn't understand him. "Nobody's going to hurt you. You're safe now." Chen knelt beside him. "I'm not sure 'safe' translates well here, Sarge. I'm getting the impression they've heard promises before." When McDougal returned with the blankets, Sullivan distributed them himself, moving with the same careful patience he'd learned during Margaret's illness. Each woman he approached shrank away initially, but gradually accepted the offered warmth. The girl in the corner, Sullivan found himself thinking of her as the one who reminded him of Margaret, watched his every movement with sharp intelligence behind her fear. "Can you ask her name?" Sullivan requested as he held out a blanket to her. Chen spoke in halting Korean. The girl's eyes flicked between them, calculating. Finally, she whispered something so quietly Chen had to lean closer. "Soonja," Chen translated. "Her name is Soonja Kim." Sullivan nodded at her respectfully. "Soonja," he repeated, trying to pronounce it correctly. The sound of her name in his foreign accent brought the faintest flicker of something. Surprise? Hope? To her eyes before the shutters closed again. The medics arrived an hour later, led by a graying sergeant who took one look at the women and immediately began issuing quiet orders for extra supplies. Sullivan watched Soonja during the initial medical assessment, noting how she submitted to the examination with resignation that broke his heart. She'd learned not to resist, he realized, learned that fighting only made things worse. "They're malnourished," the medic reported to Chen. "Dehydrated. Some show signs of the extensive trauma. They'll need time and gentle handling. These girls have been through hell." As the afternoon wore on and temporary shelter was arranged, Sullivan found himself repeatedly drawn back to check on Soonja. She'd accepted a clean shirt to replace her torn uniform, but still sat apart from the others. When he brought her a cup of water, she took it with trembling hands but watched him over the rim as if expecting him to demand payment. "Tell her she doesn't owe us anything," Sullivan said to Chen. "Tell her the war's over. She's free." Chen translated, but Soonja's response was barely audible. "She says she doesn't understand what free means anymore," Chen reported, his voice heavy. "She says men always want something." Sullivan felt something twist in his chest. "Tell her I have a sister, had a sister. Tell her some men just want to help." When Chen relayed this, Soonja looked directly at Sullivan for the first time. In her eyes, he saw not just fear, but a terrible, learned wisdom about human nature that no 19-year-old should possess. Yet beneath it all, buried deep but still flickering, was something that looked almost like hope. As evening approached and the women were settled into clean quarters with hot meals, Sullivan stood outside their building smoking a cigarette and trying to process what he'd witnessed. Liberation was supposed to feel like victory, but this felt like something else entirely, the beginning of a much longer battle. One that wouldn't be won with weapons, but with patience, time, and the kind of persistent kindness that asked for nothing in return. 3 days had passed since the liberation, and Lieutenant Chen found himself spending increasing hours with the Korean women, piecing together fragments of their stories like an archaeologist reconstructing broken pottery. He carried a small notebook now filled with Korean phrases phonetically spelled out in his careful handwriting alongside snippets of testimony that kept him awake at night. Soonja remained the most elusive puzzle. While some of the other women had begun to share pieces of their experiences, she communicated primarily through silence and observation. Chen noticed how she positioned herself near exits, how her eyes tracked every male soldier who entered their quarters, cataloging threats with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading danger before it struck. "She was a seamstress," Chen explained to Sullivan as they stood outside the women's temporary housing, watching through the window as Soonja helped distribute the evening meal. "Factory work in Taegu, good family, her father sold fabric, her mother took in sewing. She was the eldest of 4 children." Sullivan watched Soonja move among the other women with quiet efficiency, ensuring everyone had food before taking her own small portion. How'd she end up here? Chen's jaw tightened. Recruiter came through the neighborhoods in 1941. Posted notices about factory jobs in Manchuria, good wages, housing provided, chance to serve the war effort. Soonja's father had died the year before. Her mother was struggling to feed the younger children. So she volunteered. She thought she was saving her family. Chen flipped through his notebook, finding the page where he'd recorded her halting account. The recruiter was Korean, spoke their dialect perfectly, even had official documents with Japanese seals. Soonja signed a 2-year contract, promised to send most of her wages home. Through the window they watched Soonja pause in serving the meal, her hand trembling slightly as she ladled rice into a bowl. The simple domestic action seemed to steady her, and Sullivan noticed how the other women looked to her for guidance despite her youth. The train didn't go to Manchuria, Chen continued, ended up at a military outpost near the Chinese border. That's when they understood what they'd really signed up for. By then, it was too late to run. Sullivan felt his stomach clench. He'd heard rumors about the Japanese military's use of Korean women, but the reality of it sitting across from him in the form of Soonja's haunted eyes made it impossible to dismiss as wartime propaganda. She hasn't spoken Korean since the 2nd year, Chen added quietly. Says she forced herself to forget it, thought it might make survival easier if she became someone else entirely. Yesterday was the first time I heard her use her native language since we found them. Inside the quarters, Soonja had finished serving and now sat cross-legged on her bedroll, carefully mending a tear in another woman's shirt with the needle and thread Sullivan had requisitioned from supplies. Her movements were precise, economical, the habits of someone who had learned to find purpose in small acts of care. "What does she say about going home?" Sullivan asked. Chen was quiet for a long moment. "She doesn't believe she can. Says her family thinks she's been working in a factory, maybe even thinks she's dead by now. How does she explain 3 years of silence? How does she walk back into that world carrying what she's carrying?" The weight of it settled between them like a stone. Sullivan thought of his own homecoming after Margaret died, how impossible it had felt to pretend normalcy when grief had reorganized his entire understanding of the world. But that was nothing compared to what Soonja faced. "She keeps asking if we're really Americans," Chen said. "Apparently they were told that if Americans ever captured them, they'd be tortured and killed. Better to jump off a cliff than fall into Allied hands." Sullivan watched Soonja complete her mending and hand the shirt back to its owner, a girl who couldn't be older than 17. The younger woman smiled shyly, and Soonja's face softened almost imperceptibly in response. "But she stayed," Sullivan observed. "She stayed," Chen confirmed, "even when some of the others talked about running that first night. She told them to wait, to watch. Said she'd learned to read men's intentions, and something about us felt different." That evening, Sullivan made his usual rounds, checking that the women had everything they needed for the night. He'd developed a routine, approaching slowly, announcing himself clearly, keeping his hands visible. Most of the women had grown accustomed to his presence, some even offering small nods of acknowledgement. Soonja was awake when he reached her corner of the quarters, sitting with her back against the wall, watching the door. In the lamplight, Sullivan could see the careful intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she assessed his every movement. "Kamsahamnida," she said suddenly, the Korean word unfamiliar on her tongue after so many months of disuse. Chen, who had accompanied Sullivan on his rounds, looked surprised. "She's thanking you," he translated, "but more than that, it's formal, respectful, the kind of thanks you give to someone you trust not to hurt you." Sullivan felt something loosen in his chest. "Tell her she doesn't need to thank me. Tell her I'm glad she's safe." When Chen translated, Soonja studied Sullivan's face for a long moment. Then she spoke again. A longer sentence that made Chen frown in concentration. "What did she say?" Chen hesitated. "She said your eyes look sad, like someone who's lost someone important. She wants to know if that's why you're kind to us, because you understand what it means to be broken." The directness of it caught Sullivan off guard. He thought of Margaret, of those final weeks when she'd grown too weak to leave her bed, but still insisted on teaching him to cook her favorite meals as if she could leave him with something useful when she was gone. "Tell her yes," he said quietly. "Tell her I had a sister who taught me that taking care of people is the most important thing we can do, and that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter what's happened to them." Sunja listened to the translation, then nodded slowly. She spoke one more word. Margaret, the English name sounding strange in her accented voice, but somehow exactly right. "How did she—" "You said your sister's name yesterday when you thought no one was listening," Chen explained. "She remembers everything, Sarge. Every kindness, every threat, every promise. It's how she survived." As they prepared to leave, Sunja called out softly in English, broken, heavily accented, but unmistakably intentional. "Good night, Sergeant Sullivan." It was the first time she'd spoken his language, and hearing his name in her voice felt like a small miracle. As they walked back to their quarters, Sullivan found himself hoping that somewhere in the careful reconstruction of Sunja's trust, they were building something that might eventually resemble healing. The temporary refugee camp took shape with military precision over the following week, transforming from a collection of canvas tents into something resembling order. Sullivan had thrown himself into organizing the meal service with the same methodical care he'd once applied to tending Margaret's medicine schedule. He requisitioned extra supplies, set up a proper field kitchen, and established mealtimes that provided structure to days that might otherwise stretch endlessly for the women who had nowhere else to go. Sunja appeared at the edge of the mess area every morning precisely at 7, always the last to arrive and the first to finish. Sullivan had begun timing his own breakfast to coincide with hers, not approaching directly but positioning himself where she could observe his routine. He'd learned that she found comfort in predictability, in understanding the patterns of the people around her. "She's watching you again," McDougal muttered one morning as he helped Sullivan portion out scrambled eggs from powdered mix. "That Korean girl sits there studying you like you're some kind of puzzle she's trying to solve." Sullivan glanced over to where Sunja sat alone at the far end of a long table, her tray containing only a single piece of toast and a small cup of watered-down coffee. The sight of her minimal breakfast had become a source of growing concern for him. While the other women had gradually begun eating fuller portions as their fear diminished, Sunja seemed to subsist on barely enough to keep her standing. "She's afraid the food will disappear," Chen had explained after Sullivan asked him to inquire about her eating habits. "Says if you get used to having enough, it hurts worse when it's taken away. Better to stay hungry than risk disappointment." The logic was heartbreaking in its practicality. Sullivan began leaving small portions of food in strategic locations, an extra roll near where Sunja sat, a piece of fruit on the serving counter after she'd passed through the line, never directly offering, never making her feel obligated, just creating opportunities for her to take what she needed without having to ask. Lieutenant Chen had become their unofficial coordinator, managing not just translation, but the complex bureaucracy of their situation. He spent his mornings radioing headquarters about repatriation plans and his afternoons conducting what he diplomatically called interviews with the women, documenting their stories for the military reports that would determine their fate. "Command says transport to Korea is being arranged," he reported to Sullivan one afternoon as they watched Sunja help another woman practice writing English letters in the dirt with a stick. "But it could be weeks, maybe months. The political situation is complicated. Nobody knows who's going to be in charge when the dust settles." Sullivan felt his stomach tighten. "What happens if they can't go home?" "Displaced persons camps, probably. Maybe resettlement somewhere else." Chen's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen how these bureaucratic decisions played out for refugees. "Not exactly what they've been hoping for." The uncertainty had begun to affect all the women, but Sunja seemed especially sensitive to the shifts in mood that accompanied each delayed promise and revised timeline. Sullivan noticed her growing more withdrawn again, spending longer periods sitting by the camp's perimeter fence, staring toward the mountains in the direction of Korea. One evening, as Sullivan cleaned the mess area after dinner, he found Sunja lingering near the serving counter. She approached hesitantly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being watched, then pointed to the large pot he'd used to prepare rice. "Rice," she said in careful English, then switched to Korean and gestured toward the pot. Sullivan looked to Chen, who had been helping with cleanup. "She's asking about your method," Chen translated. "Says Korean rice is prepared differently, wants to know if you'd like to learn the proper way." The offer surprised Sullivan. It was the first time Sunja had volunteered information about anything, let alone something personal from her life before. He nodded eagerly, perhaps too eagerly because Sunja took a step back. "Tell her yes," he said to Chen, forcing himself to speak calmly. "Tell her I'd be honored to learn." Over the next few days, Sunja began appearing in the kitchen area during meal preparation, initially just observing but gradually offering small corrections to Sullivan's technique. She showed him how to rinse the rice until the water ran clear, how to adjust the water levels based on the grain type, how to let it rest properly after cooking. Her English, limited as it was, proved sufficient for basic cooking instructions, and Sullivan found himself learning Korean words for ingredients and techniques. The cooking lessons became an unspoken arrangement between them. Sunja would arrive early, help with preparation, and Sullivan would save the best portions of each dish for the women's meals. In return, she began eating slightly larger portions herself, though she still maintained her careful rationing habits. "She's teaching you more than cooking," Chen observed one morning after watching Sunja patiently correct Sullivan's knife technique while preparing vegetables. In Korean culture, sharing food preparation is about trust, about accepting someone into your family circle. Sullivan had sensed something significant about their kitchen interactions, but hadn't understood the cultural weight. He watched Sunja taste a soup he'd made following her instructions, saw the brief flash of satisfaction when it met her standards, and felt a warmth that reminded him of those precious moments when Margaret had approved of his attempts to recreate their mother's recipes. The breakthrough came during the second week of their cooking partnership. Sullivan was struggling with the pronunciation of a Korean word for seasoning when Sunja began to laugh, not the polite, restrained sound he'd heard from her before, but genuine laughter that transformed her entire face. For a moment, she looked like the 19-year-old girl she was supposed to be, rather than someone aged beyond her years by trauma. "You're Korean very bad," she said in English, still smiling. "But your heart very good." The comment caught Sullivan off guard with its simple directness. Sunja seemed to realize she'd revealed more than she intended and quickly looked away, but the moment had created a shift between them. She began staying longer after meals, helping with cleanup and occasionally asking Chen to translate more complex conversations about cooking or American customs. "She asked me something interesting yesterday," Chen told Sullivan as they prepared for another evening meal service. "Wanted to know if American families really sit together for every meal, like she's seen in the mess hall. Said in her family, they only all ate together on special occasions. Usually someone had to work late or there wasn't enough food to go around." Sullivan thought about his own family dinners, how his mother had insisted on gathering everyone around the table even when money was tight, how those shared meals had been the foundation of their connection to each other. "Tell her that good families take care of each other," he said, "and that means making sure everyone gets fed, no matter what." When Chen relayed the message, Sunja nodded solemnly, as if filing away another piece of information about how the world might work when it functioned properly. That evening, for the first time since their liberation, she took seconds of the rice she'd helped Sullivan prepare and ate every grain on her plate. By the third week of August, the camp had settled into rhythms that felt almost normal. Sunja had begun arriving earlier for kitchen duty, her movements more confident as she guided Sullivan through increasingly complex Korean dishes adapted to their limited military supplies. She had started speaking English in complete sentences, still heavily accented but clear in her meaning, and Sullivan found himself looking forward to their morning conversations about ingredients and techniques with an anticipation that surprised him. The change in Sunja had become noticeable to everyone in the camp. She stood straighter now, made eye contact more readily, and had even begun helping some of the younger women with basic English phrases. Chen reported that she'd started asking questions about America, what the cities looked like, how families lived, whether Korean immigrants were welcome there. The question suggested something Sullivan hardly dared to hope for, that she was beginning to imagine a future beyond mere survival. She asked me yesterday if American men really treat their wives as partners, Chen told Sullivan as they watched Soonja teaching another woman how to fold dumplings with scraps of dough Sullivan had managed to procure. Wanted to know if it was true that women could choose their own husbands or if that was just propaganda. Sullivan felt a tightness in his chest. What did you tell her? The truth. That some do, some don't, but that the law gives women more choices in America than she's ever had. Chen paused, watching Soonja patiently correct the younger woman's technique. She's trying to figure out if she could have a normal life somewhere. If what happened to her would matter to people who didn't know her story. The observation struck Sullivan with unexpected force. He'd been so focused on Soonja's daily well-being that he hadn't fully considered the larger questions she must be grappling with. Questions about whether someone who'd endured what she had could ever truly belong anywhere again. That evening brought the breakthrough Sullivan had been hoping for since their liberation. Soonja stayed after cleanup, as had become her habit, but instead of the usual practical conversation about the next day's meals, she seemed to be gathering courage for something more significant. "Sergeant Sullivan," she said carefully, the formality of his title sounding strange after weeks of working side by side. "I want to thank you for—" She gestured helplessly, lacking words in either language for the magnitude of what she was trying to express. "You don't need to thank me," Sullivan replied, echoing the same response he'd given her that first night. "You don't owe me anything." Soonja shook her head firmly. "You are wrong. I owe you very much. You give me back." She struggled for the English word, then spoke in Korean to Chen, who had remained to help with translation. "Dignity," Chen provided. "She says you gave her back her dignity, that you treated her like a person, not like something broken." Sullivan felt his throat constrict. "Soonja, you were never broken. What happened to you? That was done to you. It's not who you are." When Chen translated, Soonja's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. She spoke again in Korean, a longer passage that Chen listened to with growing emotion. "She says that for 3 years she forgot she was human," Chen translated, his voice thick. "Says she learned to survive by becoming nothing, by disappearing inside herself. But watching you cook, seeing how you care for people without wanting anything back, it reminded her that goodness exists, that maybe she could be good again too." The words hit Sullivan like a physical blow. He thought of Margaret, of how she'd worried in her final days that her illness made her a burden, how he'd spent hours trying to convince her that loving someone didn't diminish when they needed care. Here was Soonja, carrying a different kind of wound but the same fundamental question about her own worth. "Soonja," he said, stepping closer but stopping when he saw her automatic flinch. "Listen to me. You are good. You've always been good. Nothing that was done to you changed that." She listened to Chen's translation, then surprised both men by responding directly in English. "How you know this? You cannot see inside me." Sullivan considered the question seriously. "Because I watch how you take care of the other women, because you teach them English and help them with their food and make sure the youngest ones eat first, because when you had every reason to give up, you chose to keep living. That takes incredible strength and goodness." Soonja absorbed this, tears streaming down her face now. She wiped them away impatiently, as if embarrassed by the display of emotion. "In Korea, I am ruined woman. No family want me. No man marry me. I am—" She searched for words, then spoke in Korean. "Polluted," Chen translated reluctantly. "She says she's polluted, untouchable." Sullivan felt anger rise in him, not at Soonja, but at a world that would burden a victim with such cruel judgment. "That's not true. That's what people who don't understand say because it's easier than facing the real enemy." "Then why I feel so dirty?" Soonja asked, her voice breaking. "Why I cannot feel clean no matter how much I wash?" The question hung in the air between them, raw and desperate. Sullivan recognized the weight of it, the way trauma could make someone feel permanently stained by experiences that were never their choice. "Because healing takes time," he said finally. "Because what happened to you was wrong, and your heart knows it. And it's going to take time to believe that you survived something terrible instead of becoming something terrible." Chen translated carefully, and Sunja listened with the intensity of someone hearing a possibility she'd never dared consider. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "You think I can heal?" she asked in English. "I think you're already healing," Sullivan replied. "I think every day you choose to help someone else, every day you get up and keep going, you're healing. It doesn't happen all at once." Sunja nodded slowly, wiping away fresh tears. "Thank you," she said again, but this time the words carried a different weight. Not the gratitude of someone who felt indebted, but the acknowledgement of someone who had been given a gift she was finally ready to accept. As they prepared to close down the kitchen for the night, Sunja moved with a lightness Sullivan hadn't seen before. She hummed softly while washing the last of the dishes, a Korean melody that sounded like something from childhood. For the first time since their liberation, she seemed to be inhabiting her own life rather than simply enduring it. The news arrived on August 18th like a physical blow. Chen found Sullivan in the kitchen where he'd been preparing lunch with Sunja's patient guidance, her presence beside him having become as natural as breathing. Chen's face carried the weight of bad tidings, and Sullivan felt his stomach drop even before the lieutenant spoke. "Transport to Korea is delayed indefinitely," Chen announced, his voice carefully controlled. "Political situation is too unstable. Command doesn't know when we'll be able to arrange repatriation." Sullivan watched Sunja's face as Chen delivered the news in Korean. The light that had gradually returned to her eyes over the past weeks flickered and dimmed. Her hands, which had been confidently seasoning a pot of stew, began to tremble. The wooden spoon slipped from her fingers and clattered to the ground. "How long?" she asked in English, her voice barely audible. "We don't know," Chen replied gently. "Could be weeks, could be months, maybe longer." The words seemed to physically stagger Sunja. She gripped the edge of the prep table, her knuckles white against the scarred wood. Sullivan reached out instinctively to steady her, then stopped himself when she flinched away from his movement. "I need to tell the others," Chen said quietly, then left them alone in the suddenly suffocating space of the kitchen. Sunja stood frozen for several minutes, staring at nothing. Then, without a word, she turned and walked out. Sullivan called after her, but she didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear him. Through the kitchen window, he watched her make her way to the camp's perimeter fence, where she sank down in the dirt and wrapped her arms around her knees. The announcement devastated the entire camp. Women who had begun to hope, to plan, to imagine reunions with families they hadn't seen in years, now faced the crushing reality of indefinite limbo. Some wept openly. Others retreated into the same hollow-eyed silence that had characterized their first days after liberation. The fragile sense of community they'd built began to fracture under the weight of disappointment. Sunja stopped coming to the kitchen. She stopped teaching English to the younger women. She stopped eating regular meals, reverting to the minimal survival portions that had worried Sullivan weeks earlier. When he tried to approach her, she turned away. When Chen attempted to translate his concerns, she responded with single-word answers or silence. For 3 days, Sullivan watched helplessly as Sunja withdrew into herself. She sat by the fence for hours, staring toward Korea with an expression of such profound loss that it reminded him of Margaret during her worst moments, when the tuberculosis had made every breath a struggle and hope seemed like a luxury they could no longer afford. "She's not just grieving the delay," Chen observed as they watched Sunja from across the compound. "She's grieving the possibility that she might never make it home at all, that her family might never know what happened to her." Sullivan felt a familiar helplessness, the same crushing sense of inadequacy he'd experienced during Margaret's final weeks when all his care and attention couldn't cure what was killing her. But this was different. Sunja wasn't dying. She was losing faith, and somehow that felt even more urgent. The morning of August 20th dawned gray and humid, matching the oppressive mood that had settled over the camp. Sullivan woke before his usual time, restless and unable to return to sleep. The mess hall was empty when he entered, the silence feeling heavier than usual. He moved through his morning routine mechanically, checking supplies, lighting the stove, beginning preparations for breakfast that few of the women would eat with any enthusiasm. On impulse, instead of preparing the standard military rations, Sullivan found himself reaching for ingredients he'd been hoarding. Flour from a recent supply drop, some preserved fruit his sister had sent from home before she died, a small container of real sugar he'd been saving for a special occasion that had never come. His hands moved without conscious decision, mixing batter for pancakes the way Margaret had taught him during those Sunday mornings when she'd been well enough to cook. The familiar rhythm of cooking soothed him slightly. He adjusted the heat on the griddle, poured the first circle of batter, watched it bubble and set. The sweet smell filled the kitchen, carrying with it memories of home and normalcy and Sunday mornings when the biggest worry was whether there would be enough syrup to go around. "What are you making?" The voice startled him. Soonja stood in the doorway, her hair uncombed, her clothes wrinkled from sleeping in them. She looked smaller than usual, diminished by 3 days of grief and hunger. "Pancakes," Sullivan said carefully, not wanting to presume that her appearance meant she was ready to engage again. "My sister used to make them on Sunday mornings." Soonja approached slowly, drawn by the unfamiliar aroma. She watched as Sullivan flipped the first pancake, revealing a golden-brown surface that looked almost perfect. When he slid it onto a plate and set it on the counter between them, she stared at it as if it might disappear. "For me?" she asked. "For you," Sullivan confirmed. Soonja picked up the fork he offered and cut a small piece. The moment she tasted it, her composure crumbled. Tears began streaming down her face. Not the bitter tears of despair she'd shed over the delayed transport, but something deeper and more complex. She took another bite, then another, crying steadily as she ate. "It tastes like," she began in English, then switched to Korean, speaking through her tears. Chin appeared in the doorway, drawn by the smell and the sound of Soonja's voice. He listened to her words, his own eyes growing damp. "What's she saying?" Sullivan asked. "She says it tastes like kindness," Chin translated, "like Sunday mornings with her family when she was small, like the world before it broke apart." Other women began gathering in the mess hall. Attracted by the unusual sounds and smells, Sullivan cooked batch after batch of pancakes, his movements steady and sure as Soonja sat beside him, no longer crying but watching his technique with the focused attention she'd once given to rice preparation. As he worked, Soonja began to speak, first to Chin in Korean, then directly to Sullivan in her careful English. She told him about Sunday mornings in Daegu, about her mother's attempts to make Western-style breakfast when they could afford the ingredients, about the way her youngest brother would steal bites of batter when he thought no one was looking. "I had forgotten," she said as Sullivan placed another fresh pancake in front of her. "I had forgotten that good things exist without price, that someone can give you kindness just because they want to." The other women joined them gradually, drawn by the unusual warmth in the kitchen and the sight of Soonja engaged with the world again. Sullivan cooked until his supplies ran out, watching as the simple act of sharing breakfast began to repair some of the damage done by hope deferred. "Kamsahamnida," Soonja said as they cleaned up together, the Korean word carrying new weight after days of silence. Then, in English, "You remind me that I am still alive. Not just surviving, alive." Sullivan felt something lift in his chest, a lightness he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. As he watched Soonja teach him the Korean word for pancake, her laughter genuine for the first time in days, he understood that healing wasn't a destination but a choice made fresh each morning, one small act of hope at a time.